look like we have our guests that have entered into the Sean Inspires podcast interview for today. I have gracing the platform of the Sean Inspires podcast, Mr. Eric Christiansen. Eric, we're so glad to have you join us. How are you? We're so glad to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. I have here with us at the Sean Inspires podcast, Eric Christiansen. He's visiting with us via Zoom for the interview today from California. So I'm going to get right into the segment. Welcome, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing great, Sean. Thank you.
So glad to see you, and we're so glad to have you. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started and start by reading your bio here, and then I'll go ahead and pitch over to you for you to grace the platform in your own words. All right? How's that sound?
Sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. So we have today audience Eric Christiansen, seven-time Southwestern Emmy Award recipient, is a documentarian whose four films focus on the impact of trauma on individuals, families, and communities. A trauma survivor himself, having lost his home in the Santa Barbara Painted Cave fire disaster, he understands trauma, the resilience of the human spirit, and how important hope is to heal. His new film, Unmasking Hope, follows a desperate group of people whose extraordinary stories of survival most of us have heard only in the snippets of the news. Having lived through mass shootings, terror attacks, combat, and sexual assaults, these brave trauma survivors don't mask to hide their pain and suffering as they navigate their new existence that is often stemmed by PTSD, physical injury, and emotional trauma. In order to heal, they must confront what's happened to them and begin their journey from seclusion to inclusion. I love that. And as we follow their moving stories, we are all inspired to find hope again and be who we were born to be. NYU's Dr. Arish Shalev, one of the world's most foremost experts on trauma, said Eric is one of the very few who associate trauma with renewed hope, and this comes from his true understanding of the topic. His careful listening to trauma victims and his true belief that things can change for them. Stanford University trauma expert Dr. Amit Atkin added, Eric captures beautifully not only the range of emotions arising from trauma, but also the tension between healthy recovery and persistence of illness. His storytelling is highly evocative and has been an honor to take in. Christensen's previous films, Faces in the Fire, Homecoming, it's a veteran vet's journey searching for home, coming back from war, have been transformative in its recovery process for thousands of people whose lives have been compromised by mentally, spiritually, and physically by trauma. Searching for Home, Coming Back from War has aired more than 2,300 times nationally on PBS, tied to Memorial and Veterans Day. Leveraged as educational tools by top mental health institutions, Christensen films uniquely migrate from the entertainment arena into environments that help additional audiences navigate the profound collateral damage trauma creates. The New York Times called his last film strikingly photographed and sure to give comfort and support to countless veterans and their families. By spotlighting these survivors in their journeys, Christensen has been able to help unify a variety of audiences around the power of hope and educate the general population about the complexities of trauma. Christensen has also produced for major networks such as Discovery, TLC, PBS, MTV, and IMAX Film. This is an amazing and impressive bio, but I would like for you to just share with the audience, in your own words, Eric, who is Eric Christensen?
Thanks, Sean. And yeah, that is pretty amazing. It's great to hear right now. it's complete. It's validation for me because right now I'm in the post-production and the editing portion of the film, and it's kind of lonely. I'm in a little tiny room, not this room, in a different edit suite, and it was good to hear that. But through my own words, I'm Eric Christensen, and first I'm a husband, and then I'm a dad, and then I'm a man in recovery that follows God, and then I'm a filmmaker, a healer, and a messenger, and that kind of wraps it up. And it really, all the details were what you already read, but that's who I am in that order. And I'm completely blessed to be able to have been, on this life journey from losing my home in the Painted Cave fire to finding my calling through that, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. But because of that fire, that's why I'm sitting here now speaking with you on my fourth film, Unmasking Hope. And the process of doing my fourth film, it's almost like it's still my first film, but we can talk about that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so glad to have you. And so for the listening audience, today's segment, we're covering mental illness and also technology. And Eric is now talking about his film that he's working on, Unmasking Hope. So I think we're just going to dive in right there and talk a little bit about that film. We want to go ahead and let the audience know what to look for in that amazing documentary. So if you could share with us, what was your inspiration for creating that documentary, Unmasking Hope?
That's a great question. It's the logical evolution of my work. Going back 30 years to my first personal film, I've done a lot of other work, but I've done 4 personal documentaries, that focus on trauma and recovery and grief recovery. But if you go back to my first film, Faces in the Fire, that was the start of this whole evolution of my films. And I called that film was a grief recovery film. And it was my grief recovery and the other survivors that are in the film. And it's about after the fire, after the incident, and our recovery. And how that stems right now into Unmasking Hope, that was the start of the whole series. And then I started discovering through that first film that all these people's stories that they're telling about recovery from trauma, about grief recovery, they're very, very similar, totally different, like situations and just settings and, different genders, economic stratus, the whole thing. But the basic story arc was all the same, and so then I did Homecoming: A Vietnam Vet's Journey, about the veterans, Vietnam veterans, coming to pretty much an epiphany about their service in the Vietnam War, following a motorcycle pilgrimage from California to the Wall in Washington, D.C. And I noticed, well, these veterans healed the same way as these disaster survivors did. And then searching for home, coming back from war, I'm like, okay, let's really mix it up. Let's put different veterans from different eras, different generations. We had World War II veterans, we had Korean veterans, we had Vietnam veterans, we had the guys that are returning home now. Not just guys, we had female veterans from Iraq. And I'm like, what do they really have to do? How do they connect with this guy that served in the Korean War out of Kansas that's a Purple Heart Marine? I'm like, and then when I started laying it out in the edit room, I'm like, oh my gosh, they had the same story arc. Our hearts healed the same way. Grief and trauma recovery are very similar. So introduce Unmasking Hope. I'm like, let's mix it up even further. Let's get out of the veterans, just the veteran trauma, and let's expand this. My thesis for this film is we all heal basically the same way. We all unmask our hope the same way. And so we have mass shooting survivors. We have 9/11 survivors. We have sexual abuse survivors. We have our veteran. And, as I go through the stories, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many similarities. They're all healing the same way. Wow. And so it's a call to understand that, we're all kind of in this together, no matter if you've been in a mass shooting or you were a 6-year-old that was sexually abused, and you have to come to terms with that, deal with the grief, the loss of your innocence, deal with all of that. It's very much the same kind of trajectory and story and arc that recovery is as the person that survives a mass shooting, believe it or Amazing. Not. And it's a call for tolerance and understanding that we all heal the same way. We're all going through something. Grief touches us all. We lose. As humans, we all lose something and we all grieve something. There's always something on our hearts, and we're going through the same thing, so that's where Unmasking Hope came from.
I love that. I love that you have been able to bridge. As you were talking, I felt a strong surge of bridging. You were able to bridge nationalities. It didn't matter, even in gender. You were able to bridge the perspective of what healing looks like, which leads me into my next question. So, mental illness has become a major discussion lately in our country during the pandemic. Do you believe there's a specific reason of why now mental illness has been highlighted across the country lately?
That's a great question, and and I have a definite opinion and answer on that. Is that the pandemic itself and asking us to isolate, basically isolation. I guess the solution to the pandemic is isolation. But unfortunately, isolation is antithesis of recovery. That is the last place you want to go when you're in recovery from drugs and alcohol. You're in recovery from trauma. You're in recovery from depression. You're working through your depression. Isolation is the last place you want to go. So it's made a lot of these situations that were probably almost bearable if we were able to see our groups, if we're able to be out in public, if we're able to reach out, do our normal life. But this threw a huge curveball at us. Some of us went into some pretty serious isolation. And then on top of that, it just makes a situation that we already had, it makes it worse. It makes that time alone makes it worse. We are social human beings, no matter where you are. We're a social being. Our souls need to connect. And unfortunately, this pandemic kind of broke a lot of ties. So the issue of mental health obviously is coming up because a lot of us are hitting I don't want to say a bottom, but our situation that was maybe bearable before has become quite acute. And I can say that from personal experience because I've been in recovery from drugs and alcohol now for 30 years through the grace of God and in the program that I have. Not going to my meetings and not seeing my people, it's a very difficult thing. And so I had to figure out some workarounds. I go to smaller groups now. I see my mentor once a week. I have to stay on track. Isolation, my own personal thinking. I can't dig myself out. I need other people. And I think that's in general, that's the truth with any sort of recovery from trauma, PTSD. I mean, we need connection, depression, anxiety. We need connection. And sometimes talking to your therapist through Facebook isn't cutting it. We need to be there and maybe shed a tear and use their Kleenex and wipe our eyes and get a hug.
Yes,
And so that's why it's become an acute problem. In a way, it's almost, I hate to say it, I always try to see the positive. In a way, it's a blessing because it brought this thing to the forefront. So we can see that there are so many people touched by mental health issues.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And this is the next thing up. I was going through a lot of the things that you have done and looking at the common thread of hope in all of it. And that is so inspiring in itself, the word hope, right? For the listeners out there in the audience that may have had some symptoms of mental illness or going in and out of phases of mental depression, what would be one of the first steps that you could share with them for them to take? They may be afraid, they don't know where to turn, who to talk to. What would be a relatable first step for them to take in the direction of being healed and moving into that level of hope?
Oh, that's a great question, man. And it just depends. Well,